Hi, my name is Eric Necessian, and I'm an intern at 3DTI. I'll be continuing this compositing presentation by talking about compositing within Maya and After Effects. I'll be talking about the two ways of breaking up an image within Maya by using render layers and render passes, and how to combine the two for more complex compositing. I'll introduce layer-based compositing by showing After Effects, and then passing off the presentation to Chris, who will begin the node-based compositing part of the presentation by introducing composite. So here we have our sample Maya scene. We have a spotlight shining down, and these three Christmas tree lights will serve, Christmassy balls will serve as our centerpiece. We have a ground to receive the shadows, and here you should be accustomed to the display layers by now. They serve to organize your scene and to hide objects, and to hide them from view and also from rendering. So here you see I have like the green bulb hidden in this layer. So render layers is kind of similar, but it's focused on rendering. So usually you'll have this master layer, which is what you'll always be rendering from to start with. And the first a time you should be introduced to rendered layers is when you're introduced to ambient occlusion, because it needs to use a different material on your objects to produce that ambient occlusion shading. So render layers can be set up any which way. You can put all the objects on them. Some of the objects you can change up the materials, you can change up the lighting. It's useful for keeping your scene, some elements of your scene the same, but changing some to get different render results. So here I have the master layer. Here I set up an ambient occlusion layer. I removed the ground plane, I removed the light, and I put a surface shader on the balls. So here you can see, so let me just render out an image, and here you can see the ambient occlusion. And if I jumped back to the master layer and just did a rendering, you could see here's our master beauty shot. So you see the beauty of setting up different render layers. You can jump over, I can do my ambient occlusion. You can even start separating stuff out, like the specularity, reflectivity, shadows. So this layer, I kept the background, the light, the balls, but I just put a white Lambert on the balls in the ground. And let me render that out real quick. And you see I have a shadow pass. So everything is white except where the shadows are, where they start getting a dark gray and a black. And if you bring this in and you break out the image using render layers, you'll get color, spec, reflectivity, and shadow in kind of the same way that I just broke out this darkness, and you can then layer them to composite back together and to easily change the attributes of each layer to refine the quality. So if you just want to change the shadows, it's very easy to do that. Now, render passes is another option in Maya to break out your image for use with compositing. Render passes is only used within Mental Ray, and it has its own tab within the Mental Ray render settings. Now, to do this, you have to break out, usually everything is going to be on master layer. If you're going to keep everything there, to render it out, it's fine. You can just use the master layer. Sometimes you're going to want to break out different objects on different render layers and then do different render passes so that you have the shadows and the reflections and the specularity of each different object broken out separately that you can then work with separately in compositing. But for right now, I'm just going to use the master layer and have one layer with the passes. So you just create a new passes, and here you'll get a huge list of everything that Mental Ray can break apart. So you have diffuse without shadows, motion vector for motion blurring, ambient occlusion, camera depth, incandescence. You'll get specularity and reflectivity. So I'm going to do the specularity without shadows. Let's see, reflection. I'm going to break out the raw shadows and diffuse without shadows. I think that'll be good for this lesson. So here we have our diffuse, reflection, shadow, specularity. Now the next step is to associate them with the current render layer. So if you were going to break out like each bulb on each layer, you would have to link each pass with each 3 layers, but we're just going to leave them on one layer for now. So here's the diffuse being linked up to this master layer, which has this master beauty shot. And then we'll switch over to reflection, shadow, and specularity. Now we have all 4. Now that we have all our render passes set up, let me just go into render settings. And what's very important with compositing is that you use an image format that has alpha channel. So I usually use Targa or PNG. Or RLA is another large format that can handle a lot of information. But what's important is you have the alpha channel on, because that's going to cut away, give a transparency to areas that just aren't there. So it'd be the background. These balls would have opacity around them in the background, and then that's what allows for the layering, because then the transparent areas like this background just gets cut out and don't get blended and built upon. So now that I have everything set up, I can just do a batch render to kick this all out. And real quick, you see that these, I turned on the layer 2, the ambient occlusion, and the master layer. And the master layer had render passes attributed to it. So when you do a batch render, it's going to kick off every layer that you have turned on for rendering. And I put it in a subfolder called test. And you see here, it actually built out the 3 folders. So ambient occlusion, you can see it did an ambient occlusion pass. Layer 2, which was just shadows, you see that it did the shadows. And the master layer had the render passes broken out. So master beauty is just the full-on, nothing broken out. Here we go, we have diffuse, just a flat diffuse coloring, the reflection, the shadow, and shadow is reversed here. White has shadow, black is nothing. That we're gonna have to use a different blending mode for. And the specularity. So all was the render out of Maya. It's broken up into its different components using render layers and render passes. And now let me bring it into After Effects. So this is After Effects. Over here on the left is your project window where you would import in assets. Here in the middle is your composition, which would show you your final rendering that you could render out. And down here is your timeline, your project scope, where you would bring in your assets to use them. So this is a layer-based system. So if you're familiar with Photoshop, you start with your base layer, and then you can add layers on top of it. Think of like screen printing, or I keep building on top of a layer and a layer. So here I brought in my assets and I named them. So right now these layers aren't showing because I turned off the eye, but let me turn on the eye here and make it visible. And here's just the diffuse layer. And I have the normal mode, meaning it's just there, nothing special, just bring in the image. Right? This is going to be the reflection layer, and I brought it in, and it's right on top of the diffuse. Right down here I have on the beauty layer, that's the actual final beauty shot that was kicked out of Maya, but I might use that to smooth some areas, but I'm not going to use it right now. I'm just going to diffuse and reflection. You see here I have a screen which is going to make the whiter areas bright. So you can try out different layers, types to see what kind of effects you could get. You see how much more variation you can get so much quicker just playing around in this 2D system than if you had to do this in Maya. And you can also, each screen has like the opacity. You could bring it down, see how strong of a reflection you want. So let's bring in specularity. And again, you have to try a different type of effect to bring in a different type of effect on your final compositing. So again, it really depends on what kind of image you're going for, but I'm just showing you how you can bring in different layers and then blend them. So here's ambient occlusion. Usually these up here will darken, these will lighten. So I'm just going to do a multiply. You can even do effects, like I'm going to blur it. You can see this effect is kind of grainy. So I'll just put a blur on that. You see it just smooths out the ambient occlusion because it was a cheap, like a 16 sample ambient occlusion. But I smoothed it out, which would be very expensive in Maya, which is another benefit of sometimes compositing. And let me just bring in one of my shadow layers I brought in. Again, you're going to want to darken it. And maybe just bring down the opacity. And there you can see, so easy to manipulate these images in compositing instead of doing it in Maya. And now I'm going to pass it off to Chris to introduce node-based compositing with Composite.